Welcome to Film at 50, a podcast that celebrates semi-centennials in the world of cinema. I'm your host, Brian Rowe. Very excited to welcome Stevi Costa to the podcast today to talk about a big one, Sisters, written and directed by the great Brian De Palma. How are we doing, Stevi?
Good. Thanks for having me, Brian. I'm excited to talk about this very weird film with you.
Thanks so much for being here. So, as we were talking about a little bit before we started recording, this was kind of the breakthrough for Brian De Palma. He had made feature films before, two of which I believe star Robert De Niro, like a very young Robert De Niro. But this was kind of like the first foray into genre filmmaking, horror, where he would go in the rest of the 70s with films like Obsession and Carrie and so many great titles to come. Like, what was your kind of first reaction to this movie when you saw it? Like, how were you introduced to Sisters?
I was actually introduced to Sisters when I learned about it at an academic conference I was at in 2012.
Wow, okay.
This was, I know it's kind of late for like a person who worked at video stores for a long time. This was a De Palma I came to late, and I'm not even sure I totally realized it was De Palma until it came up in this lecture. But the speaker was Peter Hutchings, right? The late, great horror film scholar. And this was a conference on it was a disability studies conference, so it was focused on media representation of the disabled body and thinking through a variety of different genres. So I came to this from the more literary side of things, and was at the time in graduate school working on my master's thesis. And then Peter Hutchings was there, and he was doing this. He was doing a lecture, and I actually found my notes from this. He was doing a lecture called Monstering the 1970s. And he was looking at primarily two films, which was The Sentinel, 1977, which I don't know, and I don't remember him talking about that at all. And then Brian De Palma's Sisters. And so some of the things that he was thinking about when he was doing this presentation is like this question of, well, what is freakish in this film, right? And so this is a film that deals, of course, with conjoined twins, murderous conjoined twins. We cinematically love a story about quote unquote murderous freaks, right? Going all the way back to Todd Browning's Freaks, 1932, of course, which Hutchings did also touch on. But he was actually, in just refreshing my memory of his conversation about this, he was thinking a little bit more about the character of Grace and how it's less the literal freak in that film of our murderous conjoined twins that's being constructed as freakish, because we don't really know until about an hour in that that's what's going on. I mean, at 16 minutes if you understand what you're seeing when you see Danielle's scar, but you don't really know until an hour in when you see the video from the Institute.
Right.
So up until that point, the thing that's being considered the freakish thing in the film is actually Grace and like her independence and her forthrightness. She's this woman who's constantly gaslit by other people in the film, even though she is right and in trying to solve this Black man's murder, right? Like, and she's morally right on a number of levels there. So he was thinking about it in that way, and I just kind of was like, I have to watch this thing that I haven't heard of. And so I think I probably watched it sometime later that year in 2012 or 2013, and hadn't really put much thought into it since. And then my husband was like, hey, that's 50 years old. And I was like, my God, this film is 50 years old. Well, I guess I'll watch it again and talk about it with Brian.
Yeah, we should tell our listeners and viewers, your husband is Marcus Gorman. He's been on this podcast a lot. So I've had him on maybe 10 to 12 times. He loves to talk musicals. And even though it's not 50 years old, he loves to talk about the movie Cats. Very big fan of Cats.
He has our local cats expert here in Seattle. He loves cats. Big fan. Yeah. Anytime he can compare something else to Cats, he's like, this is like Cats.
Yeah.
I guess.
Yeah. So it's a thrill to have you on for the first time today, Stevi. Before we get more into Sisters, I'd love for you to just talk about kind of your history with film. Why has it been important to you? What are 2 or 3 of your favorite movies of all time? Like, just kind of give us a little bit of your background with movies.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think I just mentioned, or I imagined that I maybe mentioned this. I think I just mentioned that I worked at a video store for a long time, and somehow, after putting away several popular Brian De Palma titles, had missed Sisters somehow. Maybe Hollywood Video didn't even carry it. It might have been like too weird for Hollywood.
Right. Hollywood Video, I remember that in the 90s. They wouldn't carry just anything. It was like they had to know people were going to rent it. So maybe Sisters might not have been there. I don't know.
Yeah, might not have been. And then also like Hollywood obviously is like big on new releases, right? Video stores kind of bread and butter is new releases unless you're a specialty store. But like the stuff that moves off that new release wall, it's sometimes like if something gets broken, damaged, or rented out and disappears, it might not get replaced. So maybe a story with like my Hollywood Videos copy of Sisters is that somebody was like, treasure, must have, cannot return. It is worth the $143 I will owe the video store forever for this VHS. I don't know.
Yeah.
But anyway, so yeah, I worked at a video store for a really long time. Actually met my husband in a screenwriting class when we were just kiddos, youths. And so I've always enjoyed film. And now I like to say that my primary relationship to film is that I'm a proud #SIF wife. That is one of the film festivals my husband works for.
Yes.
And so my job is just to like look cute and go to parties and talk to people about movies, which is not a bad gig, I gotta say. Not a bad gig.
I like that. What are some of your all-time favorites? If you had to pick a couple, like what come to mind?
Yeah, well, according to my Letterboxd, and I would generally give this answer to anyone outside of Letterboxd anyway, my top 3 of all time all happen to be films about writing. That's what I do. I'm a professional writer. I used to be a writing teacher for a long time, much like you. And so my top 3 are Peter Kaufman's Quills, which I think I saw, like, I was probably too young to really see it, but you can see maybe like I'm here to talk about Sisters, which has some gore and body horror and violence, and Quills also does, but it's like the violence is about like creativity, and then on a non-horror horrific body related note, I love Almost Famous, which my husband and I share. That's one of our top 3. We're big fans of that film, and I also love Moulin Rouge, which is about writing in a totally different zippy zany way.
So you really like going to the movies from like mid 2000 to mid 2001, because that's when all those movies came
yes,
out.
I think that was about the time, right, when I was like, the world is open to me, and all of these are lodged in my brain, right? And those, it's like those are the formative ones that I think really stick with me. But if you ask me to choose some stuff outside of that, I found myself talking about Double Indemnity a ton this week. Love a lot of the like old Billy Wilders. I love old film noir. Big fan also of classic musicals. So my tastes range. My tastes have quite a range. I also like horror film. Love watching weird horror film. I'm super into. Wow, who am I into right now? Who's my guy?
Like new horror stuff or older horror stuff?
No, new horror is great, but my man Ken Russell, I love Ken Russell films.
The Devils? That guy?
I just watched The Devils. Yeah, I just watched that with my friend Evan. Yeah.
We did that for Film at 50, and I found like an online version of the unrated cut, like that has everything, and that was pretty outrageous. It was something else. I was like, is my guest going to show up for this? Like, is she going to be just like, I'm out?
Yeah, totally. Ken Russell's like that, You're like, well, that was like a little too much for me,
Yeah, I love Billy Wilder too. Sunset Boulevard is my favorite film. I just think that is a perfect movie. I love that movie, that
Great
story,
choice.
those performances. And then, your favorites from the early 2000s. I bonded with one of my best friends, Katie Bodie, over Quills very early in our friendship. We both loved that movie, and I like it got some Oscar nominations, but it wasn't a movie I don't think many people were talking about 2-3 years later.
No,
right?
I think most people have forgotten it.
But that was a really interesting time in Kate Winslet's career too, because post Titanic, she was trying not to capitalize on her stardom by taking big like mainstream romantic comedies but doing more kind of like subversive material like that, and Holy Smoke and Hideous Kinky and all of these really interesting kind of darker stories. I really like what she did there with her career too. And Almost Famous is just amazing. Like that movie, like I saw it at the perfect time. I was just about to turn 16. So that, and I was a writer then too, and it really spoke to me. That's again one of the if not perfect, near perfect movies ever made. I love that film. It always holds up every time I revisit it.
It really does. Now I have to ask though, do you prefer the cinematic cut or untitled?
Oh, that's a good question. So, I don't do this as a podcast or anything, but when a movie I love celebrates its 20th anniversary, I rewatch it. And so I rewatched Almost Famous in the fall of 2020,
Mhm.
and I think it was streaming somewhere. Like I have the copy I have is the theatrical cut. So whether I watched it there or I watched it streaming, it was the theatrical cut. But you're right, I do need to go revisit the longer the director's cut, because that one
Mhm.
was really terrific too.
Yeah, Untitled has a couple of scenes that I think help deepen the actual
Right.
relationship between Penny and Russell, so it
Mm,
feels like a little less like she's being exploited.
yeah.
Which is certainly, I think, a critique people might have of the film as
Mm,
we look back to the 70s and go,
yeah.
wow, what a weird time. How bad this was for many
Yeah.
reasons, for many people who were not cool white dudes with guitars, you know?
Yes. What is your take on films of the 70s? That's kind of our focus on this podcast, at least for a long while here. Like
Yeah.
what's kind of your take on that decade of cinema?
Oh boy. When Marcus listens to this, he will laugh because he knows exactly what I'm about to say, which is that I tend to really tune out of most films from the 70s.
Really? Okay.
And that is because while I recognize that there were a lot of visionary directors who were
Mm,
doing cool things, like this is the birth of independent cinema in a way, right?
yeah.
We're getting outside of this is the decay of the studio system, and
Hmm.
things are changing and becoming new, and that's all really exciting and cool, except that they are all, and it's a generalization, but like
Hmm.
so many of these films are just like these ambling, pointless narratives about white dudes.
About white dudes,
Like,
yep.
and I'm like, oh my God, is this another one where like a white guy is just like sad about something for a while? And now I see this like as a scholar of like American literature, right?
Yeah.
And so the literature of that time period is roughly the same. I get it, right? It's like the key period of time for like white dudes being sad about stuff in these kind of shapeless light plot films. And
Yeah.
even you know, you think maybe you think Altman might be the solution to that, right? Somebody who has like a lot of different characters and story
Hmm.
threads, but even then I still think most of them are too shapeless. I'm like, where are these going, you know? So for me, I'm not a huge fan of films from the 70s, but again, right, I think like some of the genre stuff that comes out of the
Mm,
70s,
yeah.
it's pretty interesting. Like horror from the 70s takes some weird and wild turns, and I think that that is one of the better offshoots of the cultural context from whence that's arising, you know.
Yeah, because before 1968, you could only do so much in a horror film. You couldn't get
Indeed.
away with very much. And
Mm-hmm.
then you get like Rosemary's Baby and Night of the Living Dead, and they're starting to push the limits a bit at the end of the 60s. And then it's still kind of safe, a lot of safe horror films in the early 70s. Like it's not until like the mid part of the decade you start getting some really vibrant, exciting titles like Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Carrie, which I love, which we'll get to in a few years. But Sisters, I feel like, is one of the first of the decade to really like put like a directorial stamp on the genre and say, this is something a little bit different, a little bit dangerous that we're not used to in the genre. Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I would agree with you there. And I think it does it in a way that's really cinematically interesting.
Mm,
That's actually, I think, one of the things I like most about Sisters is all of the work that De Palma is doing with the camera to
right.
frame this narrative for you and to really kind of enhance what it is thematically about, right? Like this is sisters. This is about conjoined twins who are separated late in life, not separated at birth. And
Mm-hmm.
then it takes this kind of like Jungian psychological approach to that narrative, right? Like the idea that Dominique is now a sort of shadow self or sublimated personality living within her living sister Danielle, who
Right.
is our antagonist,
Kind
our
of.
murderess. She's definitely our murderess, I suppose we can call her that. But in doing that, right, like it's wait, shoot, where was I going, Brian? What was I trying to say? I had a good thought, and then I got lost in the semantics of what we call Danielle.
Of Danielle.
Oh man.
Just saying, like I was talking about like his directorial stamp on like how
Thank
this
you.
was a really big push forward in the genre at this
Yes, thank
time.
you. Great. Right. So it's about these two different perspectives, right? Like kind of living within the same narrative arc, let's say, like if Danielle and Dominique, you want to consider them as a person, also a narrative arc. He's doing so many interesting things with the camera that reinforce that idea for us, right? Like we're
Mm.
first introduced to Danielle through the TV show that she's participating in,
Yes.
which I think for a modern viewer, you go, is this a reality show? And it feels kind of uncomfortable and unsettling based on the
Yeah.
content of that.
I thought it was a dream or something fabricated. It wasn't until I was really paying close attention. I'm like, wait, no, this is actually happening, right?
Yeah, and Peeping Toms is a game show, right? Which I'm like, so weird. The 70s and game shows, what the strangest concept for a game show.
It's like
Will
that.
this
It's
guy
like
act normal?
yeah, it's like Requiem for a Dream, like that
Mm-hmm.
dream scene with Ellen Burstyn
Yeah.
on that show. It has that
Yeah.
similar vibe. So I think if you're
Yeah.
watching Sisters 50 years on, you think that you're watching some sort of weird hallucination,
Yeah.
right? But it's
Totally.
actually, this is in the movie, this is something that's actually happening.
Yeah, but what you're saying there, right? Like it sets up a framework for a couple of contested meanings or contested ways that we might see this film, right? Like Peeping Toms is a game show. It is also something real in which Danielle is participating, and yet she's also acting, so she's not playing herself, which is why when we first see her, we think she is blind, but it turns out she actually has a completely different disability later on in the film. It's revealed to us. But then there's also like the witnessing of Philip's murder. When Grace sees that from her apartment, you are seeing that building from outside when we've only been in the interior of the apartment. So now we're getting this rear window kind of situation.
Oh, right.
I love the split screen when Grace and the cops come to Danielle's apartment after the murder, and you're seeing literally that interrogation from these two different perspectives. And it's such a trip, right? Like, but he does all of that stuff. And then I think there's also, a couple other places where like you see something through a pair of binoculars. So there are all of these different ways of framing the narrative that you're seeing through these mediated kinds of techniques. And to me, I think that just really like emphasizes what this is narratively about. Like this is a film that is about differences of perspective when it comes to what we are witnessing and what we should believe and accept as a dominant narrative. And I think that's both for the Grace and Danielle relationship and also for Danielle and Dominique.
Yeah. Yeah, and you mentioned the split screen and some of these directorial choices. There's, this movie's big on voyeurism. That shot of the man dying and putting his hand on the window, and then you see across the way, like as he's doing it from the perspective of the opposite side. I feel like you can't really talk about Sisters without at least mentioning Alfred Hitchcock, because Hitchcock is all over this movie, including the amazing score by Bernard Herrmann, which feels very much like a classic Hitchcock score. It was almost unsettling for me yesterday to be like, oh my God, this is like you close your eyes and this is a Hitchcock film. And so I read a little bit about it. Like they were temping the movie with old Herrmann tracks.
Oh, that's interesting.
And then they were like, do you think Herrmann would actually do this? Like, would he was in semi-retirement in 72, but they reached out to him and he read the script. He liked the script. And so he agreed to come on and do it. And it's just, it feels like the score to a Hitchcock movie we never got. And it's really in your face, fantastic, very rhythmic and gorgeous score to this movie.
Yeah, just with like a touch more theremin.
And it makes the movie bigger in a way. Like this is a very kind of small movie. Like it doesn't feel like it costs very much. Like it's very grainy.
Much.
The film stock is very grainy, and there's some awkward editing at times. It does kind of feel like the work of a director who's kind of starting out, like someone who doesn't have everything polished yet. But then you bring in this big harmonic score by Bernard Herrmann. This feels like it's out of a Hitchcock film, and it does kind of raise the game a little bit in the movie, which I admired a lot. I thought that was a great addition to the movie.
Yeah, I agree. I think the score really elevates a lot of the content, in addition to the camera work, which I just think is very cool. It also reminds me, I kept thinking about a different De Palma film while I was watching this. I think about this film as being in conversation very much with Blowout.
Oh, right. One of his best.
Yeah, Blowout, awesome, definitely. Those are my top 3 De Palma for sure.
Yep, me too.
But it's but that's so much about audio, right? And it's doing all of this work with sound, right? Using the technology that you can use in cinema to help tell the story. And I think this does similar things, but with visual techniques.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And so I first came to this movie in high school, I loved Carrie when I was young. Like that movie, like I got into Stephen King when I was very young, like 9, 10 years old. Like I was reading Stephen King in fourth grade. I did a book report in front of my teacher and the whole class on Carrie. And my teacher pulled me aside after I finished. She said, Brian, that is not appropriate material for this class. Please, you can read Stephen King, but please do not give another book report on him again. And so as I got into his books, I started seeing some of the movies when I was young. My mom wasn't so much into me watching R-rated horror films when I was like 10, 11, but my dad has always been a big horror nut. And so he was okay with it. And so very early on, I loved Carrie. And then I was, even back in those days, like the late 90s, you could go on IMDb, you could look up a director's filmography. And so I just started watching a lot of Brian De Palma's films. I saw Blowout when I was very young. And I saw Sisters. I remember it was like sometime in high school. And the scene I've never forgotten from this movie is the murder scene about 30 minutes in with the birthday cake. That is such a striking moment. And when I put this on again last night, that was the only part of the movie I remembered. And then watching it again last night, I'm like, oh, the reason that's the only real scene I remember is it is really one of the only kind of original, exciting moments in Sisters. In many ways, the second half of this film was kind of like a procedural. It was kind of like a mystery trying to solve who the killer is. Margot Kidder is surprisingly not in this movie very much. Like I wouldn't even call her the protagonist antagonist. Like she's a supporting role in this movie. Like she kind of disappears from it for chunks at a time, which surprised me. Like did that come off as kind of odd to you as well?
Yeah, and I guess the other thing that I was thinking about is that I truly, in watching this, kept asking myself the question that I think the film wants us to ask. Where I was like, wait, which one is Margot Kidder?
Yes.
I'm just not that familiar with her as an actress, and I know, I guess like maybe I should see Superman or something.
Superman.
Right? I know. But I'm more familiar with like the cultural joke that has become Margot Kidder, which is not kind. But in a way, like, isn't that already established for us, that cultural joke about her as a mentally unwell person?
Right, that's true.
Sisters?
I don't know. Does that come from Sisters, or was that just like because of some of her behavior late in her life?
It's because of her
right?
actual behavior,
Yeah.
I think. Yeah, I don't think it comes from Sisters, but yeah, I kept asking myself, I was like, wait, is she the French one, or what are we doing here? So, and I didn't bother before this to solve that question for myself, because I don't think it really matters. Like, part of the end of the film asks us to sort of put Grace in conversation with Danielle, right? Like the scene where Emile is hypnotizing them and essentially making Grace forget she ever witnessed this murder, and then kind of trying to make Danielle erase Dominique fully, I think is what's supposed to happen in that scene. So like they're actually supposed to be aligned. I think we're not really supposed to be able to tell much of a difference between who our conjoined twins are and who Grace is, in a way.
Yeah. But I do think something I've always loved about De Palma's work is that when he makes a horror film, he doesn't start off with a big like slasher kill scene. Like he starts off with character, he sets up characters, he lets you get to know them, he lets them behave normally, he lets them just be themselves. That's what's so great about Carrie, is that for about an hour plus, you're just kind of watching people behave and you get an insight into their lives. And then this just like, it's one of those things where three things happen at the same time, where this incredible tragedy takes place. And in some ways, I don't even really think of Carrie as a horror film, because it's not really, except for the last scene, really. It's like not really trying to scare you that much. It's like just telling you this dramatic story of what can go wrong when these things happen. And in Sisters, you get the same thing. We don't really get violence for 25 to 30 minutes is that birthday cake scene. Like you're just kind of like following these two people kind of fall for each other, and they have sex, and they go out, they have a date, and they meet on this game show. And so for a while, if like, especially this is his first horror film, you're not sitting there like assuming this is going to get scary or violent for a while, right? Like it's just a drama about these two people for like 25 plus minutes.
Yeah, and it's interesting for me to hear you put it in conversation with Carrie, because I think that those two films in Brian De Palma's early career are pretty aligned, right? And very
Hmm.
different than what I would say is 1980s Brian De Palma, especially if we're thinking about the way that women function in his films. Like
Right.
his 70s stuff, his 70s horror is really focused on a female perspective,
Hmm.
and I think maybe that's one of the reasons when you characterized Carrie as like, oh, this doesn't even really seem like it's a horror movie until
Yeah.
some terrible things happen, right?
Yeah.
And like I think it's intended to emphasize something that's more like innately horrifying in like female existence at that time,
Mm.
lurking under the surface, right? Like culturally, I mean, these are movies that are coming out in the early 70s. You're coming just on the other Roe v. Wade is 1973,
Right.
RIP Roe v. Wade, right? Like, so you're getting a couple of films that are coming out just on the other side of a time when women have expanded access and expanded power. And so this maybe
Hmm.
takes me back to the comment that Peter Hutchings observes about Sisters, right? That like the really scary thing is Grace as an independent woman, whereas Danielle is a dependent woman, dependent on her ex-husband
Mm.
Emile. The scary thing actually in the beginning is Emile, right? Where you're like, who is this
That's
guy
true.
who is stalking this girl? He is so weird looking and I am
Hmm.
uncomfortable. And she's uncomfortable.
Hmm.
And we're framed that Peeping Tom's show is another scene in which we are meant to think that she is in danger,
Right.
but it turns out to be okay. And then she talks to Philip about, oh, my ex-husband is here, Emile. I don't really want him to be here. He is stalking me. But
Mm.
that also turns out to be okay because it flips it on its head, right? Like we're playing with these conventions that like she is a woman who might be preyed upon, but in
Mm.
fact, she is the predator.
Yeah, I mean, you see some similarities when you look at some of his most important films, when you go from Sisters and then to Carrie and then to Dress to Kill, which we haven't mentioned, which
Mm-hmm.
has some questionable elements at the end with the twist, but for a while is probably his most successful, like Hitchcock ripoff, if you want to call it that, like where it's like it is in your face, Alfred Hitchcock in Dress to
Mm-hmm.
Kill, but
Mm-hmm.
also really putting the women first and giving us like the story of this woman who is not afraid of her sexuality, is not afraid of, getting intimate with a man, and what is it, a taxi cab or in the back of a car. But then he shows us her just brutal murder like 30
Mm-hmm.
minutes in. And
Mm-hmm.
so then you're supposed, and so that throws you, and it's kind of like Psycho, and you're like, okay, wait, what, where are we focusing here? In the case of Sisters, the confusion, the mystery is kind of down to that Daniel character, and like which one is this? Are there two? Is there one?
Mm-hmm.
Like we see different sides to her. And so that's kind of the mystery of the movie. Although you're right, when we see just a little bit of her skin towards the beginning, I think that's kind
Yeah.
of an obvious, like it kind of gives away. I'm like, I don't think we're watching two different people here,
Yeah.
but
Yeah. If you know what you're looking for, then you're like, ah, this is a story about conjoined twins. But
yeah,
yeah, I think you're right to say that kind of the mystery in that latter half of the film, the mystery once it becomes Grace's solving a crime,
right.
right? Grace is certain she saw a crime and she's going to solve it. Then yes, that mystery becomes about like, well, is Danielle one person? Is she two people? What's really going on here? And so, if you'd like, can I give you a little intellectual history of how we've thought about conjoined twins in the US?
Ooh, yes, please.
Okay, great. So this was part of my doctoral dissertation.
Oh,
So
cool.
I study the history of the freak show, and I think about these concepts through a variety of different lenses, disability studies being one of them. But like, so here's some brief and I think interesting intellectual history of how we thought of conjoined twins in the U.S. Right. So like these used to be historically called Siamese twins. This is going
Hmm.
back to the eponymous Siamese twins, Chang and Eng Bunker, who were popular around the time of the Civil War here in the U.S. But conjoined is a much better term. So that's what I'll use for the rest of this. So when they became really popular, right, Chang and Eng, around the time of the Civil War, for a couple of reasons. Like people used to put them on pamphlets in talking about the Civil War to say like, well, if these two brothers who have such different personalities can stand side by side, why can't we reunify as a country?
Mm.
So they used them for this kind of like nationalist metaphor. But largely the question was a question of personhood, right? It was, are they legally one person or are they legally two people? And they owned separate properties. They had separate wives. They lived next door to one another and would spend time in one house and then time in another house.
Hmm.
They fathered a prodigious amount of children. And in an interesting complication to the question of are they one person or two person? Well, I'll tell you, they were definitely more people than Black people were because they owned slaves.
Mm.
And ran plantations, right? Like these guys acted essentially as assimilated Southern gentlemen, basically. So if Chang and Eng were two people, and legally they were, two houses, two sets of taxes, two separate marriages, that is more than the 3/5 of a person of all of the humans that they owned, right?
Mm.
But we get another set of popular conjoined twins in the 1920s, Daisy and Violet Hilton, who I think are the physical model for Danielle and Dominique, right? They're conjoined in the same place, which is the side of their hip. And funnily enough, in the film, this is just as a side note, they say something in that Institute video about Danielle and Dominique, like having a delicate spinal conjoinment. And I was like, not where that scar is. That's just
so they
not.
got that wrong.
Well, I mean, like, it's not supposed to be a medically accurate film, you know?
Okay.
But I was just like, well, I don't really think that's exactly where your spine is, but okay. But they were very clearly modeled after Daisy and Violet Hilton, who have a conjoinment, like literally at the hip, right? That's phrasing that we use for them. And Daisy and Violet were really popular in the 1920s. They were entertainers. They performed on the vaudeville circuit. They appear in Todd Browning's Freaks, even.
Oh, okay.
So the actual conjoined twins in that film are Daisy and Violet Hilton. And the kind of question that comes up around Daisy and Violet Hilton is not so much a question of are they one person or are they two, but the question is now, well, if they get married, is it bigamy?
Okay.
So there was this whole Supreme Court case in the New York Supreme Court where one of the twins had hoped to marry their band leader that they worked with. And that case was denied effectively because the courts found that there would always be a third person present in their marital relations, and that would constitute bigamy. So the question kind of shifts, right, from this question of personhood to what I would say is a question of property, right? Like the idea there is that, well, if Daisy is always present when her sister is in her marital bed, then a man who marries one of them has two pieces of property, right? Like that's kind of the way the law interpreted it. But there's also something interesting, I think, and relevant to sisters about Daisy and Violet, which is that there's this famous story because they toured on vaudeville, they knew Harry Houdini. And so he is said to have taught them a way of kind of suppressing one of their selves so they could like have some quiet time away from their sibling. So like if one of the girls went out on a date, her sister could be there, but also just like not be there at all. She didn't even have to like bring a book to read. She could just kind of vacate herself.
Yeah.
Which I think sets up the kind of psychological context you're seeing. De Palma and his co-screenwriter, co-written by a woman, by the way, Louisa Rose, who like wrote 3 other things. I couldn't find out any information about her. But I was like, who is this person?
Yes.
So anyway, I think that's kind of a thing that like mental suppression is something that they're playing with. But in the broader like intellectual history of the sideshow, we don't really ask like questions about who is someone a person or two people when we're thinking about conjoined twins anymore. We see them so they're so rare, like they're very, very medically rare. And very few of them survive into adulthood without being separated. And there's only like 2 sets right now in the US that people would probably know about, which is, of course, Abigail and Brittany Hensel. You might remember them. They had a popular TLC show around 2006 or so.
Okay, maybe.
Abby and Brittany, they are dicephalic twins, which means they share one body but have 2 heads. And then there's another pair, George and Lori Chappelle. George is trans and was born with a different name, but they're country singers, and they are actually the country's oldest living conjoined twins.
Oh, wow.
So less of a question of like, I think we just ask different questions right now. It's not so much about personhood, it's not so much about property, but for the few living conjoined twins that are here in the United States, I think people tend to just sort of ask like, well, how do you do your life like in this modern world? It's more of a reality show question than a legal question as it was in the past. But in thinking about like, it's the 1970s. Why are we telling this story about murderous conjoined twins, right? So the question I was asking myself, and why is it also a film that like continues the problematic trope in horror cinema of treating disability as a horrific thing, as a othering thing, which it does participate in that, but maybe not in such an egregious way, because I think it's kind of doing it in an imagined way. But
Mm.
so like, okay, Freaks 1932, right? This incorporates a ton of actual real disabled people, including
Yes.
Daisy and Violet, as I said. But Freaks, as you might know, as some of your listeners might know, famously banned in many countries, including the United States,
Yep.
until it was rediscovered as a midnight movie in 1969.
Wow. Okay. It was that late.
Yep.
Interesting.
It was banned for about 30 years in the US. And then the counterculture kids in the late 60s were so into midnight movies and
Mm-hmm.
rediscovered this, showed it with exploitation cinema at drive-ins, right? So Freaks kind of gets picked up in the cultural lexicon. And that's also a period of time, like 1969 to 1975-ish, when you start really like hearing the word freak applied
Oh, okay.
to the counterculture.
Mm-hmm.
So not to people who would have historically performed in freak shows who are like real disabled people, but just to like kids who are choosing to drop out, right, and turn on to drugs and listen to rock and roll music and protest the war. A lot of those people are getting the label freak applied to them.
Hmm.
And so weirdly, at the same time as that's happening, where like the word freak is becoming less associated with this history of disability or this history of the sideshow and more with the counterculture, at the same time there is an interest in popular media in the 1970s that draws on that idea. So you start seeing characters like Characters and Sisters, who are conjoined twins. You see this sort of thing appear in exploitation cinema as well. And then, of course, in the late 70s, there is a absolute explosion of Elephant Man paraphernalia.
Oh, right.
There is a new biography of the Elephant Man by Ashley Montagu that comes out in '79, which is the same year that Bernard Pomerantz's Broadway play The Elephant Man drops, which is a year before David Lynch's film.
Yes.
So there's this whole movement through the 70s where I think people are starting to like look back at that history, and two things are happening. One is that they're using the label to help identify themselves, to say like, oh, all of the people who performed in those sideshows were outsiders, and I'm an outsider. I'm
Mm.
the counterculture. So this is me, man. I'm a freak. And then also the freak, because it is associated with the counterculture, and that is a thing that like mainstream culture is demonizing at this time, that gets brought back into our cinematic and cultural consciousness as this outsider kind of narrative. So
Huh.
those are a couple of like big cultural things I think are happening that maybe set up some other contexts for like, why is a horror film centered on this kind of figure happening in 1973? I think there's like the feminist stuff that Peter Hutchings was talking about that I brought up earlier. And then I think there's all this like weird freak show stuff that's going on too.
Yeah. So I do have a quote here from De Palma. Like, why did he want to make this movie? He was inspired to write the script after he read an article in Life magazine in '66 about the lives of two Soviet conjoined twins.
Mm-hmm.
He said at the end of the article, there was a picture of the two girls sitting on a couch, and the caption said that apart from the fact that they were joined at the hip, both girls were physiologically normal. But as they were getting older, they were developing psychological problems. One of the twins had a very surly, disturbing look on her face, and the other looked perfectly healthy and smiling. And this strong visual image started the whole idea off in my mind. So that's
Really
where it came from. It comes from a real life. It's not like he was sitting around one day and was like, what's like a scary movie I could make? What about two conjoined twins? Like, it came from this real life story, and seeing that image, one looking happy, one not, and like, how would that play on film? I do think it's interesting in the movie. We don't really get much of them actually conjoined. I think that's probably just due to the fact that it would have been difficult to show that in a 72, 73 film with the same actress. Like, I just don't think the technology was there. We get it a little bit, right? And we get like a video that plays in the second half that like tells us a little bit about her story. But like, is that something you wanted more in the movie? Like, did you want a little bit more of Margot Kidder as like both characters in the same frame, or is that not something that?
No, I don't think that would be necessary.
Okay.
Especially because I think this is a film that is trying to explore that question of what it's trying to use the conjoined twin as a way to think about shadow selves, right? Like the sort of Jungian concept of a suppressed part of your personality, which is what Dominique becomes when she is separated from Danielle. And so it's interesting to hear that, like, that's what he was thinking when he looked at that photograph of that that set of Soviet twins, right? So in the intellectual history I'm giving you, where it's like questions of personhood, questions of property, like he's starting to ask questions of psychology, right? Like, and that to me really comes through in this film. So I'm not saying I needed to like see them joined together. To be honest, it almost always looks bad in most.
Right. If they're especially if
Yeah.
it's the same actor in the same frame and they're trying to like optically show us it's it's like The Parent Trap by Disney in 61, trying to show the same actress. Like you can see it now, like 60 years on, you can see like where the line is in the middle of the screen.
Totally.
So it wouldn't have looked good, especially
Yeah.
this is a pretty low budget movie. But De Palma's always been obsessed with this idea of the double, right? Like of like the good and the bad of somebody. It's like in almost all of his movies. Like when you think about, the kind of the more Hitchcock films that he made, and there's always this like double identity. Is she good or is she bad? Or Carrie's a great example. Like she's, finally kind of coming into her own by the end of the movie, and she's in a great place. And then that just switches, and you get the opposite of after what happens to her. And I mean, you have that in even some of his like non-genre films, and I feel like that's something he's starting to play with here for the first time, which is always an interesting element. That's an interesting element in Hitchcock films as well. I mean, it plays a big role in Vertigo. The beginning of Psycho, you have like Janet Leigh in a when she has like a white bra on or a black bra on, it's kind of like showing like what side of her personality are we seeing in this moment? So it's something that Hitchcock played with a lot in his movies, and now De Palma is clearly interested in that throughout his whole career.
Yeah, definitely. And I think even in the stuff that he's doing in the 80s, right? I mean, he literally has a film called Body Double.
He has a film called Body Double in 84 with Melanie Griffith.
Great film about voyeurism, Body Double.
Yeah, it's all throughout his career. He's like, he'll do something else. He'll do a Scarface, but then he like comes back to a genre film. For a while, he really got out of doing horror. He did films like The Untouchables, which was a big hit, won Sean Connery an Oscar, and then Casualties of War, this war film, and then Bonfire of the Vanities is like such a behemoth flop and disaster that he goes back to what he likes in horror, and he makes Raising Cain with John Lithgow. He did Femme Fatale in 2002. Like even like, after Mission Impossible with Tom Cruise, you think he'd go, okay, I'm just going to do kind of more, kind of standard action studio fare. And he'll still go back and make a smaller kind of genre movie. And it's been something I found interesting in his career. Most directors who start off in horror and then get success in more mainstream stuff usually stay in the mainstream. They don't really go back very much to the like a horror genre that they did at the beginning. De Palma has been one of the few who kind of jumps back and forth. I think that's why, in a way, he hasn't quite been as successful as like some of his contemporaries of the 70s, like a Scorsese or like a Spielberg. And, his sensibilities are a little bit different. They're a little more genre based, which is why I've always really loved his work and his career. And it was really exciting, to revisit like his first movie that does that, because clearly there's a lot of flaws in this film. The pacing's kind of off. The editing comes off as awkward at times. It's not a very good movie, but what I love about it is you see the seeds being planted for what's to come. That's what I find really great about Sisters.
It's an interesting thing that you just said about horror directors or people who start in horror don't usually go back to that well. And that just made me think, like, I wonder if Brian De Palma were a different man from a different time, if he'd started, directing like maybe in the aughts or something and started in horror, he might have stayed in that lane, right? Like my man M. Night Shyamalan. Okay, much maligned. Much maligned, but I gotta say, I super respect the dude, because I've realized that I actually love M. Night Shyamalan films because they're never boring. They may be quite dumb and extremely predictable, or just off the wall nuts, but I always have something to talk about, and the camera work is always good.
Yes.
So M. Night, right? Like he did a little pivot, and he was like, I'm going to do some what you might call comic book movies, right? If you're going to think about his Avatar, not good, or After Earth with Will Smith, also not good. But when he does horror, great. And I
Mm-hmm.
think maybe too, because as you're pointing out with De Palma here, like um M. Night Shyamalan really respects Hitchcock, right? And
Mm-hmm.
he's quite influenced by that master, right? And De Palma is too. And I think like for the types of horror, and they're both good with a camera, both have really keen visual styles, De Palma and Shyamalan. I think that when you understand the kind of visual stylings of horror and you do it really well, you can stay in that lane for a long time and be really successful at it. And then
Mm-hmm.
I wonder too, I think about like our A24 crop of horror kids, right? Like our Ari Asters and
Ari
whatnot.
Aster.
Can you imagine like if Ari Aster made like a normal movie, like a adaptation of a Tony Award winning Broadway play, like Ari Aster's Doubt? What would that be,
Well, that's the thing about, something I've always been jealous of. Like filmmakers usually can, I mean, sometimes it's difficult for them in the moment, but usually filmmakers can jump around a little bit to other genres and
Mm,
audiences will be open to that. Whereas
mhm.
if like Stephen King wrote like a 300-page romance book tomorrow, I mean, he could probably sell a lot of copies because he's
He
Stephen King.
would.
But when you're kind of set in a certain genre as a writer, it's really
Mhm.
hard to break out of that. I have
Yeah.
found most people. But then you have a De Palma who could make an Untouchables. Nobody was like, I'm not gonna go see the Untouchables because that's the horror guy. Like, no one's gonna not go to the Untouchables because of that.
Well, he'd
Uh,
already made Scarface, so
and
he
he'd made
showed us he
Scarface.
can make a gangster film.
Right. Well, like Ari Aster's, I mean, like the drama in Hereditary is so
Mm.
great. I think
Hmm.
Ari Aster could make a really great movie, a non-genre movie, and just, tell the story well, get great performances from his actors. But yeah, but then you have someone like Shyamalan. I don't know. I haven't read much about like why did he do like Last Airbender and After Earth, but those two movies were such colossal flops that I think after Earth, he said, okay, if I'm gonna do this for the long haul, if I'm gonna be a filmmaker for 20, 30 more years, I think I need to make the kinds of movies that audiences want to see me make
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
make them for cheaper budgets with a studio like Blumhouse. And make them for small budgets. And if they can make money, then maybe I'll be able to make another one. And I feel like that's kind of what he's been doing for the last
Hmm.
decade since
Hmm.
After Earth came out.
Yeah.
Nobody cared. And I think he like tried to make something more studio friendly, and then when it didn't work, he was like, well, let's just go back to what I'm good at.
Yeah, which is smart. And I'll also say this is just a thing that I admire too about like where his work is right now and when the last couple of films that he's
Yeah.
made, his daughters make them with him.
Oh, cool.
So I think that's really cute that he's, like a South Asian filmmaker who's getting a couple South Asian women into film. I think that's so cool.
Oh yeah. What are their roles on the movies? They're
Um,
there like his assistants on the movie, or they
no,
have like roles
one
on
of
the film?
them does something in the production department,
Okay.
and the other one is in photography.
Oh, cool. And
So
so they kind of like they come with him to each project, like on set and things, and
yeah,
and,
and
and
they're
work
actually
with him.
working on the film. It's
That's
like a
awesome.
it's a family
Family
thing.
affair.
Yeah, and that's cool. I'm just like that's a thing that a lot of white folks in Hollywood have had access to for the century of Hollywood, and not necessarily a thing a lot of folks of color have had in Hollywood.
Yeah.
So I think that's also like it's cool to see John David Washington getting into cinema and following his dad's footsteps, but
Mm,
that's another story.
yeah.
Yeah. Although it
But
does make me think there is one thing that we didn't talk about in Sisters that I think we do need to address, which is
right,
the fact that this is a film where the only person of color is murdered
right. Brutally
brutally.
out of nowhere.
Yeah.
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 Yeah, and that was kind of disturbing to me as well because this is a point in time you're starting to see more black people in cinema. We've talked about some really great ones. They're called, a lot of them are referred to as like black exploitation films like Shaft. We talked about Superfly, and we just Marcus and I just talked about a really good one called The Harder They Come about
Yeah.
Jamaican people from Jamaica. It was like their first like major film that kind of broke out and was a
Mm-hmm.
big success, and that was a terrific film. Like you can find them around this time, but movies that a lot of just kind of general audiences are going to, I think you make a good point. No one has really brought that up on this podcast. I'm really happy you did, about how there is kind of in the 70s, especially the first half of the decade, outside of some of those movies like films with Pam Grier and some of these terrific films we're going to get to, and performances. there are a lot of white people on the screen,
Yeah.
and it's same thing with not as many female directors, right? And that's, still a case today. But boy, in the 70s, I think I've talked about 2 or 3 films on this podcast that were directed by a woman, and that's pathetic. It's ridiculous. I've done like 127 episodes.
Yeah.
And so that's something, as a gay person, I struggle with some of these films from like 72, 73, when
Sure.
there's no representation of any kind.
Mm.
Maybe like some guy walks into a scene and, plays a gay person in a way that's very offensive. You see that a lot. Whenever there's something out of the norm there, I always get very excited. Like in Shaft, of all movies, there's like a waiter, a bartender in that movie who's gay, and he's very proud to be gay, and Shaft is cool with it. Like they're talking, I'm like, this is really progressive. This is fantastic. But mostly it's like you don't see that representation very much. If you do, it's not done very well in the early 70s. And there's not there, it's odd to me that De Palma would have this African-American actor come in here just to be killed off in a brutal way.
Yeah.
And
be
a corpse for the rest of the movie.
In a couch, which is a great place to hide the body. But it is like, it is interesting because there's a part of me that thinks the film is very aware of what it's doing, because that's what Grace says on the phone when she's calling in the murder. She's like, a white woman kills her black lover, and you don't think this is news?
Right.
So like Grace is super aware of this fact, but it's like, watching it back from a modern perspective, like this is the part of the film that I think is like, it's pretty uncomfortable. Like the first time we see Philip, we don't know that he's not a predator because we're seeing him through peeping toms, and he's leering at Danielle when she's pretending to be a blind woman, and then we feel okay about that because we're like, oh, he's just an actor, that's great, and they have that little moment. But then there's this big microaggression when he gets his prize, which I guess, are they not paying these actors? They're just giving them steak knives, and
that's it.
He gets to the African room, the hottest restaurant, where he like then literally has to go to this place on a date where he's being surrounded by a cotton club, a 70s version of the Cotton Club, where it's like this stereotypical depiction of Africa. And there are lots of black people in that scene dancing behind him, but they're not people, right? In the same way. And Philip is such a nice man, actually. Like he's just a good dude. Sweet. He's gonna go get this girl cake for her birthday.
Yes.
He's going to let her have a phone call with her sister, even though her sister's I'm putting this in quotes for those of you who are on the, who are just listening to the audio. Like, he just seems like such a nice man. But I think about the moment when he gets that prize, like dinner for 2 at the African room, right? And like, there's a look on his face where I think in the 70s, you'd look at that and the look is, no, he doesn't have anybody to go with. And that's a weird prize to give somebody. But now I look at it and I'm like, that's a look of him going, this is the prize that you're giving to me because I'm black. That I'm going to have to go and sit in a theme restaurant about my own identity. Like it's very, very weird. And it's also weird that like, ultimately there is no resolution to his murder, right? Because Grace gets hypnotized out of it. So the last shot of the film is just his body in a couch in a field at an abandoned train station in Canada.
Middle of nowhere.
Middle of nowhere. And so that part, I'm like, it just doesn't age well. But at the same time, like we as the viewer, we kind of want Danielle and Dominique to get away with it, right? Like, because I think either them or Grace, choose whichever. They're supposed to be our primary points of identification in this film, not Philip, So like, that's pretty weird. It's like, it's not very comfortable. And I sort of think about that actor, and I didn't bother to like look into his career at all, but I hope he got better opportunities after playing a nice dude who gets brutally murdered in the beginning of a Brian De Palma film,
Yeah. I mean, I would like to think that De Palma hired him because he was the best actor for the role. I mean, I can't imagine he was like, ooh, let's get a black actor for this. What, the audience won't expect him to be brutally killed half hour in. Like, I want to think it was just, I mean, I think that's how the actor got hired for Night of the Living Dead in '68. Like, that was just Romero said that he was the best actor who auditioned. When everyone kind of compares that ending of that movie to like The Times, and and read a lot into it. And Romero's
Mhm.
like, oh, that was just the best actor for the role. It wasn't about
Mhm.
race. So that
Mhm.
might have been the case here with Sisters. But
Maybe.
50 years on, it is kind of it doesn't sit well because it is the one brutal scene of violence in the movie, really.
Yeah. And I mean, even if the story, of casting was in this kind of colorblind way of no, this guy was really the best actor for the role. We just really liked him.
Mhm.
It's just, I have a hard time believing that because there's the deliberate reference to the African room in the script
Right.
and that line. And I'm like, maybe they wrote that line in after they cast
Later.
this
Yeah.
guy, maybe. But still, even the presence of the line says we are aware that something weird is being
Mm.
produced by killing this man, and yet we're not going to do anything about it,
Yeah.
And it's 73, so like it's probably a true thing, right?
Mm.
Like that I think black bodies are often not considered valuable at that time, and frankly
Mm.
still aren't. So it just
Mm.
makes me 50 years later, it just makes me think about like all of the other black bodies whose murders have been un unavenged
Right.
or unacknowledged, really. Not even avenged. I don't think they have to be
Yeah.
avenged. They just need to be acknowledged.
Like the ending's not very satisfying when the last shot, and it's just like Danielle gets arrested, like they're kind of hauling her off, and then we cut to that wide shot of the couch just in the middle of Canada
Mm.
somewhere, and like
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't leave you satisfied, does it? Like this movie, it doesn't
Mm-mm.
end on like a note where you're like, yay. Like Carrie ends on a very dour, sad,
Yeah.
tragic note, but there's something
Mm-hmm.
kind of, I don't know, maybe it's the operatic music or something in Carrie. Like
Mm-hmm.
and the just the shock of that huge scare at the end with the hand coming out of the ground. You
Yeah.
walk out of Carrie feeling good. Like you're like, that was something else.
Yeah. That
And
last moment in Carrie is just a great button. Ooh.
yeah,
Yeah.
the camera zooming out, like he's just firing on all cylinders in Carrie. But at the end of Sisters, you're just kind of like, okay.
Yeah. You're like, all right, what did I just see?
What was this
What
all about?
happened? Yeah.
And there's not a whole lot of style throughout the movie outside of the kill scene. I mean, we have some of the split screen stuff, which is in a lot of this movie. Like it's in
Mm.
just very briefly in Carrie, and he'll use it in other films, usually in moments of terror and stuff. And here, as you said before earlier, like it's just like that interrogation scene. We're just seeing it from two angles, almost to the
Yeah.
point where you're like, where's the camera? like, like where is it?
Yeah. I love that though. I think that's so cool. Like,
Yeah, that was neat. And
mhm.
for him to just be bold enough to do that, I think most directors would have just let that scene play out in a normal way, just from one angle.
Yeah.
He's like, nope,
Yeah.
we're gonna see it from both sides,
Hmm.
right? So that was cool. I mean, just stylistically, the kill scene is interesting. Like the way that, I mean, it's so creepy how he just kind of he's very comfortable. He like gets down on his knees or he leans down towards her, and he's got this just ugly looking cake with this just gigantic butcher knife underneath. And isn't
Hmm.
he like, he's like, doesn't he like point the knife at her, or it's like pointed at him, like as he's leaning over, like he's just smiling.
Yeah.
And she just takes that knife, and it's like, whoa, like you don't expect it. It's so shocking. And it's like, even if you really trust someone, like I would not ever lean up against someone as they had a giant butcher knife pointed at my chest.
Yeah. Probably not. That just doesn't seem
Even if it's your loved one, I'm like, nope,
doesn't
I'm
seem
not
super
gonna do
safe. Yeah.
it.
Well, I mean, and certainly not like a guy I met yesterday on a film set, Maybe a
Yeah,
guy I met 30 years ago, but even then, I don't know.
yeah,
Cinema has told me pretty much that most straight men are untrustworthy,
that's
So
right.
like, even the ones you think you can't trust them.
Yeah, but we have this. So I mean, first he's stabbed twice, like kind of lower on his body, right? And
Yeah, the legs.
he'd be okay. But then
Hmm.
we get this shot, isn't it just of the shadow of her sticking the knife into his mouth?
Yep. Yep.
And then we get a very brief glimpse of like some flesh like dangling off the side. It's very quick because they probably didn't have the best like makeup effects for this movie. So you just see it briefly, and then he falls, and then the camera just tracks for like a while of just him kind of slowly crawling toward the knife. And right before he can get it, she rushes over and starts
Yeah.
stabbing him. It's just like,
Yeah.
it's so brutal. And it's like, and it's again, that's the De idea of like, I'm going to set up these characters for 25 minutes, get to know them, and I'm going to have this moment of like visceral violence. It's like the first time he does it in the movie, and then he would go on to do it in Carrie and Dress to Kill and so many other films.
Hmm.
But I do agree. I think it's a little, it wasn't a wise choice to have that be with a black actor. It just doesn't read well 50 years on. Just it's kind of strange. Although I do admire the style of some of that, of what De Palma's doing behind the camera.
Totally.
But then, I mean, the rest of the movie, I mean, it never bored me, but there was a point of the film where I'm like, I kind of want more of Danielle. I want like more of her behavior, her story. It's like we're just kind of go into a lot of scenes of them like investigating the maybe murder. They don't really know if it happened. And I felt like the movie started to drag a little bit, and it's only 90 minutes, and it felt longer than that to me. I don't know about you.
That's interesting.
It
I don't know
it
if
didn't
it felt too
ever
long.
it never went anywhere in the second half that was outside of like learning more about Danielle, and we get that video of her history, the background. That was cool. I just felt like the movie was lacking something. There was like something that the movie wasn't pulling me in as much as I was hoping it would, especially with that core concept. And Margot Kidder, who I've always found to be a very compelling actress. I mean, I've only seen her in maybe 5 or 6 films, but she's always like Amityville Horror is another big one outside of Superman later in the decade. She's just got like a striking look, and her accent in this movie is really interesting. I wanted more of Margot Kidder. That's my review.
So you would have actually liked to see Dominate.
I don't know if it needed to be a flashback or something, but I felt like she would disappear for chunks of the movie, and that felt weird to me because maybe part of it was my expectation. Not having seen it since high school, I thought she was just like the lead of the movie, and then I'm like, oh, she's not. She's still only in part of the film. So maybe that was just my expectations there. But I just felt like the second half, it just didn't quite work for me as well as the first half did. I felt like everything up until the moment of violence I found really compelling, and then the rest of the movie only worked in fits and starts. But it's still, I think this movie's worth watching to be a Brian De Palma completist, to see kind of where he gets his start, because this is really the beginnings of greatness and some of the really amazing films he would make after this.
Yeah, I'd agree with you there. I think there's a lot of value in being a completist of someone's body of work, and that was like my pandemic activity. Is that I would pick a director, or sometimes I would pick a theme for the month, and I'd be like, this month we're only watching female directors, and I would just like watch a bunch of stuff. Or this month we're only watching Ang Lee movies, and we have to do that, right? So like. So working your way through somebody's body of work, I think, is a really interesting educational exercise to see what you're pointing out, Brian, right? Like where they start and how those core concepts or visual like styles, themes, all of that, how that evolves over the course of their careers. I think that's an interesting way to guide your viewing and helps alleviate choice anxiety, which is something I think we all have now.
There are so many movies out there that I've gotten to the point now where every January I pick one actor and I pick one director, and slowly, sometimes it's like 2 a month, like slowly from January to December, I will just like watch everything they did. So this year I'm doing Katharine Hepburn, who I adore, and I've only seen like 6 of her films. Like I've seen like the big ones, but I haven't seen the smaller stuff. And then I tried to, who did I do last year? I didn't quite get to all of his films because I got so busy. So I decided this year I was going to do David Lean, because he only made like 15 films as opposed to someone who has like 50. I was like, let's pick someone with a smaller body work. And I've only seen David Lean's his Lawrence of Arabia, Dr. Zhivago. I have not seen his early work, like Blithe Spirit and Brief Encounter, and some of his early stuff that's supposed to be great. And I have not seen Summertime, which he made with Katharine Hepburn. So I'm like in the middle of the summer, I'm gonna bring them together. Like I'm gonna have the one film that they collaborated on together, and then go on to the other stuff. But I think great. I think that's an amazing way to look at films, is to really, especially with directors, is to see like, how do they evolve in their work? Like, do they keep hitting on the same themes 30 years later? Are they moving on to other genres? Every director's different, and you never really know what you're going to get. So I find that really interesting. I think I've never done a year of Brian De Palma. Boy, that would be a great year. Because you're getting a lot of genres, you're getting a lot of big movie stars.
Yep.
You get I feel like every next movie is different. There's like something different about everything he does. He's never just like repeating himself like movie after movie. I mean, from Sisters to Dress to Kill, you're getting some of the kind of Hitchcockian films. But even in there, I feel like he made a film called The Fury in like 78. That's
I just
more of
watched that.
is
Yeah.
that a horror film? Is that like a scary movie?
It is
I've
a
never
horror
seen it.
film.
Okay.
It, much like Carrie, deals with telekinesis.
Oh, okay.
And
Doesn't it have a big cast? Doesn't it like some names in it? Or am I thinking of a different movie?
it does. It does have some. I literally just watched it last night, but I'll tell you, I was like,
Oh,
this is not my vibe. It was not my fave.
I haven't heard good things about it, so I haven't gotten around to that one
But
yet.
it does have quite a cast, and yeah, you know, in I would say that it is definitely in conversation with Carrie, right? Like in the sort of horror mechanism is telekinesis, and it is focused on women and like this kind of idea of like what is psychologically repressed and how does that happen through supernatural ways, which is also true of Carrie and true, I think, of Sisters. You could put it in that category too. So, you know, if you're gonna be completist, then I think you got to do it.
Yeah. So I think he has one of the most fascinating careers as a director, as we'll talk about as we get to more about him at the end. He did make some clunkers too. I mean, he made probably at least 4 or 5 really bad films. Like,
yeah,
for a person as talented as he is, it's kind of like, what happened there? But before we get to our final 2 segments, just a few other things about Sisters. I did get this quote about voyeurism from De Palma I wanted to read. He said, the theme of voyeurism is represented in the alternating points of view and distortions of perspective. De Palma commented, I really got the idea from watching the Vietnam War on television, watching a war that nobody really knew about, except we watched it every night on the 7 o'clock news. It was really a voyeuristic war. And I think it says a lot about the way we perceive things. We are very much controlled by the media, which present things to us, and those things can be manipulated. So I thought that was an interesting quote. He said he's like Hitchcock. He's been obsessed with the idea of voyeurism, I think, throughout his whole career. And that kind of the story about watching Vietnam from a voyeuristic point of view. It's just on the news every night. It's kind of like the beginning of COVID, right? We were just like watching it on the news. It didn't feel real. It didn't seem like something we'd have to actually contend with in our lives. It was like, oh, this is something on the news. Kind of voyeurism, this idea. And that's something he's been really interested in throughout all of his film.
Yeah, I think you definitely see that in all of his films, as you're saying, and in this one, right? Like, and in some way, I like hearing that deliberate connection to Vietnam in this, because I think that pings off some of the other cultural frameworks that I was offering as like possibilities for why are we thinking not just about like a story that centers women in this moment, but like also a story that centers figures that we would historically call freaks, right? Like,
right. I love what you said about I've never really thought very hard about the word freak, you know, but it is interesting to think like nearly 100 years since Todd Browning's film. I wonder how much of that movie has kind of gone into what we all think of the word freak and how how that can be used to describe someone who is different, whether that's through something with their face, their body, or just someone who likes different things than we do.
Yeah,
totally. The show Freaks and Geeks, you know, kind of brought a new way for us to look at that word.
Yeah, with that outsider mentality.
That outsider mentality.
Yeah.
That's when I'm like, when I think of the word freak, like what do I think of? I'm gonna have to think about that now because I haven't really put a lot now into it. It's interesting.
Yeah, well, I mean, I had to. I wrote a whole dissertation on it, so I did that, so you don't have to.
That's right.
But now you mentioned that, you reminded me that we are 10 years away from a 100th anniversary for Todd Browning's Freaks.
Yeah, it came out in 32, right?
Yeah. Okay. I'm like, all right, I got to start planning my like speaking tour. Gotta prep that lecture so that film festivals just book me to talk about it.
I was never gonna do film at 100. I don't think I would have. No. I do admire silent films, but I don't think that would have been my. It was either film at 50 or film at 40 because of the alliteration, and I'm like, who cares about a 40th anniversary of a movie? Like that's not like once in a blue moon, like there'll be a preview as like celebrating the 40th anniversary of it, but you don't really see that ever. Whereas 50s, that's a milestone.
Yeah,
you know, that's why The Godfather had a 50th anniversary theatrical re-release. Like that's a big deal to get halfway to 100. So that's kind of why I ultimately went with the films of the 70s. And there was also so many movies this decade that I haven't seen, so this is like giving me a reason to go back and look at some of them. Hopefully more films that aren't just sad white guys walking around. It's funny when you said that because my favorite film of 1970 is Five Easy Pieces with Jack Nicholson, and that's definitely what that movie is.
Oh boy, Jack Nicholson is like my least favorite. Oh man, I can't.
You don't like Jack, huh? Jack is
No, I
not
don't. The
in
vibes are
anything.
bad. The vibes are bad. I mean, he's very well cast because he's often intended to give bad vibes. But I think he's I find him extremely off-putting.
You find him off-putting.
I find him extremely off-putting. And when he shows up in something that like I'm not expecting, no, I don't walk out. I just like, I just get the vibes are bad.
It's like a guest of mine, Sherry, who's going to be on this month for another horror film. She detests Tom Hanks. She can't watch. She can't watch Tom Hanks. Like she doesn't even watch the movie. And she brought this up in an episode we did like a year ago, and I just could not. I was like, what? Of all, she's like, there's something about his acting, the way he performs in movies that is off-putting to her, and she just she'll watch some of them, but she just doesn't like it. She said an hour into Forrest Gump, she left the theater and she begged for her money back, and they wouldn't give it to her.
Wow, that is quite an aversion. That beats my aversion.
So that beats your aversion to Jack Nicholson.
I think it really does. Yeah.
So Jack Nicholson at the end of the 60s, he almost gave up on being an actor, and he was thinking about just going into writing and directing. You would have been happy if he had done that?
I don't, maybe. I mean, what?
And then he got Easy Rider and then Five Easy Pieces, and then all of a sudden, boom, like it started for him. But he almost gave up acting.
He's just so pivotal to these films of the 70s, right? And like, I think maybe there's part of my aversion to him that is simply because like his cultural legacy looms so large. And also, I think that much like Robert De Niro, like he's the kind of actor that like men love, you know, like straight men tend to venerate those two actors, but I don't feel that way about De Niro. I don't feel that way about De Niro. I don't love, I find Travis Bickle and Taxi Driver to be absolutely terrifying. And I question when a straight man says, oh, Taxi Driver, that's my favorite movie. And I go, because you understood it, or you know, like I'm like, I don't know how to read you now, you know.
Not a good thing to say on a first date with someone. My favorite film was Taxi Driver.
Taxi Driver. I'm like, oh, okay. Yeah.
The one where he takes Sybil Shepherd to a porno film and as their date, and she's like, okay, I'm gonna leave now.
right. And that, and also like his whole kind of like Captain Save a Ho vengeance arc thing. Like he's really I don't know. It's just I don't know if Travis Bickle is like the countercultural hero you want to back. I just don't know.
I think up until like Analyze This in '99, I think most people thought of Robert De Niro as like in the top 5 greatest actors ever. But then if you look at the films he made in the last almost 25 years, Robert De Niro has gone out of his way to make junk to the extent that it's like, Robert.
he's in grandpa mode now, which is like what I think as the daughter of an old Italian man, I think this happens to old Italian men where they go into grandpa mode and they just go, I'm just having fun.
Like I think if I wrote a script in the next few months and had the money, I could probably get De Niro to be in it.
You probably could.
He'd be like, what
it would be fun.
And that's not a good thing. Like De Niro, I still think, like, you know, when you look at his body, his work anyway. But yeah, I mean, I think when you go back to this period of time, when you look at especially the horror genre around this time, we're not getting a whole lot of films that are really pushing the boundaries, giving us something a little different. What I admire about Sisters is that it's clearly a director with a specific kind of vision. This is not something that just kind of came about and he's just kind of throwing stuff on the screen and seeing what sticks. Like he clearly has the kind of vision that's just going to keep growing and evolving for the next 10 to 20 years. I've really loved Brian De Palma's entire filmography outside of a few films, as we'll talk about. But before we get to our final 2 segments, real quick, the 2 final pieces of trivia I had about Sisters is that the movie got 1 nomination.
Oh,
this is the part of the conversation we usually say, okay, so what did it get nominated for at the Oscars? It didn't get, you know, any of that. The film got a nomination for Best Horror Film at the Academy of Science Fiction, Fantasy, and Horror Films convention in 1975.
Okay, cool.
That's the only nomination it has on IMDb. And part of me is like, why would it be nominated in 75 if the movie came out in 73?
Right.
Like, they needed to stew on the film for another year.
Or maybe that was the first year of that convention. I don't know.
Maybe that was the first year. Yeah, I don't know if that's still a thing. If you look at a lot of horror films in the 80s, like this will come up and it'll be like, 10 nominations. If it's like a very popular horror film. I think something like Aliens by James Cameron would probably have had a lot of nominations there. But Sisters had something. No Oscar nominations for Margot Kidder or for best film editing or anything like that.
Well, certainly not for prosthetics.
But as we'll talk about, Brian De Palma had some success with the Oscars here and there, and a big one, of course, is Carrie, which gets into lead actress and supporting actress for a horror film. Really cool, as we'll get to. And then the last thing about this movie, did you know this? I did not know of this. This film was remade in 2006 with the same title, with Stephen Ray and Chloe Sevigny in the lead roles.
I did not know about this, but when we were watching The Fury last night, or maybe when we were rewatching Sisters earlier this week, Marcus brought that up. He was like, did you know that this existed? So truly, none of us know about this. And that's wild, actually, because I quite enjoy Chloe Sevigny.
So Chloe Sevigny's great. Oscar-nominated actress. I love her a lot. I was seeing everything under the sun in 2006. I have never heard of this, that there was a 2006 remake.
Yeah,
until yesterday.
Don't know how I would have missed it. I was Prime Video Store working years then in the early aughts. Don't know how I would have missed it.
Like, I don't know. I wonder, it must not be very good. I feel like if it was even a decent film, it'd probably be a little bit more known with those two actors who are really strong. So maybe the studio, it was just an under the radar. They just threw it out on like direct to DVD or something, and it just didn't have any resonance. It just must have really come and gone, I think, what happened. But we talk about all the time, and this is my final question about the movie before we move to the final two segments. I ask my guests, we always talk about, like, what would this movie look like if they were to make it now, if they took the story and whether they made it set today, or you can always set it in the past. So they did make a version of this in 2006. I'd be curious to see what that looks like.
Yeah.
But if someone, probably not De Palma, I think he's probably moved on. But if a young, talented, horror director or someone, they said, we're remaking Sisters in 2023. Like, what do you think that would look like now? Like, what would they do differently? What would be similar? Like, what would Sisters look like in 23, 24?
Okay, I actually think this is my pitch for it. I think this is a Ryan Murphy miniseries.
Okay. Yes.
I think Ryan Murphy is probably the only person who would bother to touch this. Ryan Murphy also has a long, somewhat challenging history working with disability representation in some of his work.
Yes.
Nip Tuck, right? One of his kind of claim to fame early show projects, deals with plastic surgery. But one set of conjoined twins that I mentioned earlier actually were in an episode of Nip Tuck where they played conjoined twins. George and Laurie Chappelle played Rose and Raven Rosenberg in one of the most memorable episodes of Nip Tuck, I would say. So he does actually hire people with disabilities pretty regularly. And I think that, one question that Peter Hutchings asks about Sisters is like, well, okay, but where are the actual disabled people in this? And I will just briefly note, as I get into my Ryan Murphy explanation here, that there are a couple real, actual sideshow performers in that video of the Institute.
Oh, okay.
One of them is CeeLo the Seal Boy, who was performing well into the 70s. He has phocomalia, which means that he does not have fully formed front arms. Ryan Murphy has worked with Matt Frazier, who is an actor who shares that same disability and has also written and performed a solo show about CeeLo the Seal Boy. So CeeLo is in Sisters, and Matt Frazier has worked with Ryan Murphy. So Ryan Murphy does actually hire people with disabilities. So I think that's one thing that would be different, is that he would actually find a way to make this a story that centers disabled people more clearly. But I also think he would make it probably a lot schlockier and like, I don't know, maybe somehow more tasteless. And I don't think that Ryan Murphy, if he remade Sisters, would solve the race problem in this film. Because he doesn't have a great track record with that in some of his shows, even though in the last few years, I think he's gotten better at casting Black men in roles where they don't die.
Yes.
And he does love a strong Black female character, right? Like he has created some great roles for older Black actresses, and that's cool. But like, yeah, you know,
doesn't he have conjoined twins in one of the American Horror Stories with Sarah Paulson? Sarah Paulson, is that
Sarah Paulson
Freak
as
Show?
The Tatler twins. Yep.
Yeah, so he has had that in one of his I think that's season 4.
That is season 4. That's the same season that Matt Fraser is on. Matt Fraser plays Paul, the illustrated seal on that series. So, you know, he's doing, like, in that season, I'll just briefly say, like, he's doing a thing that was historically true about freak shows, which is that there were performers who had actual disabilities, and then there were also performers who did not. So to me, I'm like, it is technically historically accurate if you have fake conjoined twins and also a real person with phocomalia on that show. So like, that doesn't bother me. And I think Ryan Murphy would probably end up doing a similar technique, right? If he chose to remake Sisters. Yeah. But it would definitely be a 10 episode series, and it would only need to be 6.
We talk about that all the time. Every 4 to 8 episodes, we'll say like, well, could this be an 8 episode, 10 episode limited series? And I've seen some series that go on for 8 to 10 hours, and I love every minute. I'm so happy it's this long. I'm happy it's not a 90-minute movie. And then there's other shows where clearly this is like 3 hours max of story, and they have stretched it to 8 episodes, and we're just filling in time. Episode 5 is on a side character who may or may not be interesting, but you're like, oh, this episode is here because this, you know, they asked for 8 episodes and we only have enough to fill 5, and so we have to figure out like what to do here. I mean, I think the idea of Sisters being a limited series now would be we would get, you know, a lot more backstory. I would admire that. I mean, since I felt like the 90-minute movie, I felt like it was a little long. I don't know if I don't know if I'd be up for an 8 episode limited series of Sisters. It'd have to be just a banger cast, and I'd probably wait to hear what the word was about it, like if people liked it.
Yeah.
Like, wait till episode 3. Is it good? People, oh, it's good. Okay.
Like, see, if it was Ryan Murphy, I'd watch it anyway because I'm a Ryan Murphy completist. So I gotta do it.
I am too. I mean, I really struggled through the last season of American Horror Story. I just watched it over winter break, and I was just like, this show is just not, like, it had a bunch of, you know, attractive men on it. So I'm like, well, Brian, we'll watch it. We'll take a look. But it's just like the latest season I felt could have been a 90-minute movie, and it just kept, it just went on and on and on. And it's like, you know, they're stretching it out because they have to deliver 10 episodes, and that gets annoying to me when you just like, you know, like, this didn't need to be that long. But I mean, I don't know. We'll see. I mean, clearly they brought Sisters back in 2006 and no one cared.
No one cared.
So I don't think this is the title. I think it's also confusing. I mean, we've had other movies called Sisters. There's the Tina Fey, Amy Poehler comedy.
Right.
There's the new Apple TV Plus series called Bad Sisters.
Yes.
Like, I think the title is too vague.
Yes.
There's nobody in 2023 is going to go, oh, Sisters, like the De Palma film. Like, very few people will do that. So there's not that title recognizability like there is with Carrie, which has been remade like twice, 3 times.
Yeah, but you know what it is because you
know what Carrie
is. Yeah,
there's not another film. At least maybe there's another one. I don't know. But like, when you think Carrie as a movie title, you know what that's referring to. Where Sisters can be a lot of things.
Anytime somebody says Sisters, I just think of White Christmas, right? Like I think of Rosemary Clooney. So that's my first thing is if somebody ever goes Sisters, I'm like, yes, the fan dance from White Christmas. Yes.
So so I admired some of it, but it, for me, like 1973 Sisters, for me, it's like, it's important to complete the De Palma canon. I think what he does right after this, he makes some much more interesting films after this. Like, I think the next 3 he makes are much better than Sisters, but I feel like he needed to make Sisters to get where he needed to go. Like, I feel like this helped him get to the next level, so it's worth watching for that reason.
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
All right,
good stepping stone.
yeah. So that takes us to our final two segments. First one's the Divine Double Feature. What's a modern film you would pair with Sisters for someone right when Sister is over?
I had to think about this because there are a number. I just kind of kept thinking about other De Palma films, right? Which
Right.
is like your other question. So the one I arrived on is a film from 2021, starring Julia Sweeney. Is that no? That's not a person. That's well, that is a person, but I think she's deceased, and that's not who I'm thinking of. But the film is from 2021, and it is called The Voyeurs. It's a horror film.
Okay.
It's yeah.
I thought we were
So,
going to match for a second there because mine's from 2021 too. It's happened
oh,
twice in 130
oh,
episodes. It's happened twice. I thought, oh, this will be
okay.
the third time.
Well,
This is
I'll
a
be
different.
interested to hear about yours, but no. This is The Voyeurs from 2021. The writer-director is Michael Mohan. It stars Sydney Sweeney, who is a person, and
Oh,
Justice
Sydney Sweeney
Smith.
from
Yeah.
Euphoria
Yes, thank you. And from White Lotus. I was like, what's
and White
that
Lotus.
girl? Yeah. So this is a kind of, it starts with the same kind of like Rear Window vibes. There's this young couple, which is Sydney Sweeney and Justice Smith, and they move into a cool apartment in what I believe, I think this is Montreal playing New York, or it's an unspecified city, but it really feels like Canada to me. So they move into a really cool apartment, and they become obsessed with watching the neighbors across the street who seem to have no shame and no window shades. And so as they become obsessed with these people, they notice criminal activity happening in this apartment and kind of go down this rabbit hole. But it's also got some really interesting like medical horror aspects to it as well. Some scenes that involve visual justice, let's say, at an eye clinic. So it's important that Sydney Sweeney's character works at an optometry clinic here. That's the kind of like visual framing narrative that they used for some of it. But I really liked it. I thought it was super fun watch. And I think it pairs nicely with the voyeuristic aspects of Brian De Palma, and particularly of Grace's journey in Sisters. Also, a film where I think you may have some questions about casting a Black actor in the role that the Black actor is cast in.
Oh, yeah,
That's
right.
another thing I feel they have in common, without
Yeah,
spoiling anything. I'm just
that's
saying
interesting.
maybe questionable. What's your pick?
Well, it's funny you bring up The Voyeurs. I can't remember what episode it was. Someone also brought up this movie title.
Oh,
maybe
yeah.
maybe it was Marcus. I can't
maybe.
remember. But it came up in like the last 6 months, and I thought, oh, that sounds interesting. And then I forgot about it. Now that you've brought it up again, it's on Prime Video. It's on Amazon. I'll take a look. Yeah, it looks really interesting, and I love Sylvia Sweeney. I've really enjoyed her on Euphoria and White Lotus, so that'd be a good one to check out. So the first idea was sister horror films. I was like, what are some? So first I thought of it's not new enough. It's older than this, but I thought Whatever Happened to Baby Jane would be kind of like an interesting pairing because it's also about sisters and it's got a horror vibe. It's got some body horror moments, like some of the stuff in the middle of the movie. And then I also thought of Ginger Snaps. Have you seen that?
Yep, great, very fun.
The from 2000, the werewolf sister horror film. But ultimately, I landed on, I was like, what is there like? I was like, what is that horror film I saw recently that it wasn't like conjoined twins.
Yeah, all right.
But I was like, there was a horror film I watched in the last year and a half that I loved. What was the one where like they were sharing a body kind of, and one would take control of the other? Malignant by James Wan.
love
I thought
Malignant.
if you want to go into the body horror realm of like just a kick-ass insane modern horror film, I've always loved the work of James Wan, going back to the first Saw. I think he's very underrated at times. I thought Dead Silence was really good, the horror film he made about like the killer, like the dummies he made in 2007. Yeah. I've always really liked his style, and what he brings to the Insidious films is really great. And Malignant was one I put it on and I didn't expect much. It just like, remember it went to like direct to HBO, kind of Max kind of thing. And I was like, oh, this will be fun or whatever. But I got really involved with that movie, and it dealt with some really interesting themes, and the idea of like the two siblings kind of sharing that body, and one being like in her brain and like taking over at times and becoming a different person. I thought would be kind of, I like to look at the divine double feature as like taking some of the ideas of an older movie, and then what would we do if we really explored them in that genre today. And I think Malignant would be an interesting pairing with Sisters to see like, okay, now what we can do like visually in a movie that they couldn't do then, and kind of taking it on with that style that James Wan is so great at. If you like just kind of wild horror films, like Malignant, I feel like people loved it like when it came out, but I don't think people talk about it much a year and a half later. Take a
I don't
look.
know if that's true. I think like it's very popular on film podcasts.
On film podcasts, people like to talk about
reference Malignant. Yeah, to like make a joke about it because it's a super wild film. And I think you've honestly, when you said that, I can't believe I didn't think of it. I wish we had matched. I feel like I should have matched with you on this. Because it's such an obvious choice for me. It's a wild film, and you're very right about the sort of like central conceit of one twin having control of the other, being a feature of Malignant, and also birthday parties being a triggering notion is central to Malignant as well, which I thought of while you were talking. So yeah, so great. Also that screenwriter, Malignant, the screenwriter is a Black woman, and she lives here in the Pacific Northwest.
Oh, cool.
And she wrote Megan.
Oh, Megan, which just dropped on Peacock. I'm going to watch it in the next few days. I'm excited.
Yeah. Also wild and weird fun. I'm into whatever she's going to drop. So she's just,
has she directed anything yet?
No, not to my knowledge, although she used to work on the TV show Grimm. So I don't know. Sometimes they let a writer direct an episode. I haven't really dug into her IMDb, but I'm liking her horror features, and I look forward to more because she's a weirdo.
That's awesome. Yeah, I really loved Malignant, and it would be an interesting pairing. I wonder if James Wan had seen Sisters, or if that's just a coincidence.
Oh, well, I mean, maybe.
We'll
I mean, a person who gets started in Saw, right? Like
probably knows horror, of De Palma.
I'm sure you are aware. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. All right, that takes us to our final the final segment, Beyond the Flick. So Beyond the Flick, we talk about like an actor or a director, or like a theme of the film. We have not talked about De Palma yet because, as I mentioned at the beginning, like the features he made before this, I think the one he made before this was 70. I don't know if that had even come out by the time I was just barely starting this podcast. He might have made one. Did he make one in between? I'll look at his filmography now. But this is kind of his first important film. So this is really the first time we've talked about De Palma, who, as I said before, is one of my favorites. So if you could only take 3 of his movies to a desert island, like what are the 3 that you think are really strong? Like what do you love from De Palma? Which is I have like 6 of his that I really love. So it was hard for me yesterday to pick 3, but I did.
Yeah, I know, tough choices. There were 2 that were like no question for me, and then the third one was I think where I had to be like, So my no question, Blowout.
Yes, that's in my top 3.
Excellent film, love it, and probably one of the like best performances by John Travolta outside of Staying Alive, which I think he is great in.
The sequel, Staying Alive.
Yes, it's Staying Alive, which is Rocky for dancers. Love it. And it literally, I mean, it's directed by Sly Stallone, so it was Rocky for dancers. But I love Travolta in The Blowout, and I've mentioned already before in this episode everything that I love about what that movie's doing with audio, and like really thinking about the technology of cinema, and doing it in this like kind of noir crime narrative way. And I love that. I love noir, so it's super fun for me. My other one is Phantom of the Paradise.
Yes.
Which is amazing. A very beloved film in our house. Marcus and I love Phantom of the Paradise, and haven't watched it in a while. Yes, great Paul Williams music, so good. Scream Queen Jessica Harper giving a nice tenderoni soft performance in that one. And I just like, I've tried to describe this film to people who haven't heard of it, and I will usually say that I'm like, so it's what happens if you take Phantom of the Opera and you mix it with Beauty and the Beast and also with Faust. And then like literary people go, what? Cool, what? Faust? And other people go, that sounds really weird. And then you just have to say, you just got to go with it, you know? And I think it's just great. I love it. And we love Beef. We think Beef is a great character. Really just so many excellent things about Phantom of the
Yeah.
Paradise. And then for my third one, I went with Raising Cain because of
Ooh.
John Lithgow's performance in
Mhm.
it, which really stands out to me very strongly, but it was closely tied with Body Double.
Oh, okay.
Because Body Double is just like, it's De Palma at his absolute sleaziest, and I also love sleaze.
Yeah.
But Raising Cain, woo, what a great performance and a good psychological thriller. Really into it.
Yeah. Was that like was Raising Cain really like the last like just all out like horror film? Like I feel like Femme Fatale and Passion, which are kind of genre movies, those are more kind of like thrillers, more
Yeah.
the quieter thrillers. I feel like Raising Cain is his last entry of like the kind of the Hitchcockian horror films he was known
Yeah,
for.
because after that he's doing like a few action movies,
Yeah.
and well, and Snake Eyes gets thrown in there, which is funny and fun.
Snake.
And then he does like this little noir period, right? Femme Fatale, Black Dahlia. I didn't see Passion, and I totally forgot he directed Domino. But I guess this is his. Oh no, this is not the Ridley Scott Domino. So never mind. I don't care.
Yeah. Oh, that's right. Ridley Scott made a movie called Domino as well with
Yeah, so
Keira
like
Knightley.
2006 with Keira Knightley. Yeah,
That's right.
yeah.
And I feel like in the last year I pulled a quote where De Palma like just rejects Domino, the movie. Like he started it and then it just turned into something he didn't care about, and I don't even know if he was a part of the post production. It was just like, wasn't this like a was it streaming or something, like nothing action movie? Like,
Yep, so sounds about right. It's like the
is
last thing
that
on
his
his
last
IMDb.
movie?
Yep.
How old is he now?
Oh, well, I'm
Is
on
he in
his
his early
IMDb right
80s?
now.
I think he's like around 80 to 82, something like that.
Yeah, you are right on. He was born in 1940.
Okay, so yeah, so he's 80, gonna turn 83 this year
Yeah.
if he hasn't already.
Yep.
That would be sad to me. I feel like I saw Passion. I remember I was so on it, but it had two really strong lead performances, some good style. Passion would be a better final movie, I think, than Domino would be. So I'm hoping he's got one more to come.
Yeah.
But
He's got two in production right now, one in development and one in pre-production. So maybe he'll get one
okay.
more out.
Maybe he's got one more. Which is kind of silly in the long. It's like, if someone has a really great body of work and the last movie's not great, it doesn't take anything away from all of his or her great films. But I do like it when a director goes out on a really good one. Sidney Lumet makes movies for 50 years. His first film, 12 Angry Men, is terrific, and then his last film is Before the Devil Knows You're Dead with Philip Seymour Hoffman and Ethan Hawke. And it feels like the work of a 30-year-old filmmaker. It's so alive, it's so fresh. And then that's the last one. And I was like, awesome. Fantastic. When Hitchcock goes out with family plot, you're like, really?
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm pretty much in agreement with you there, except for one title. So I came to Phantom of the Paradise very late. I bought it just as an impulse buy. I think it was on eBay. I had never seen it before. I just saw it. The Blu-ray, the Scream Factory Blu-ray was packed with bonus features, and it was a Brian De Palma movie. And I said, I'm just going to buy it. Like, I have a good feeling about this one. And it's maybe my favorite Scream Factory Blu-ray movie experience of something I'd never seen before. I knew nothing about it. I'm like, how have I seen Carrie 1,000 times and I've gone through all of his films, and somehow Phantom of the Paradise escaped me until maybe in the last 5 years. I saw it like 5 years ago, and I loved it. I've watched it like 3 times since. It's dazzling. It's my number 3 choice. Although I would put very close to number 3. The ending has some issues, but I do really love a lot of Dress to Kill. Dress to Kill is very interesting.
Very good.
Great style. And I think his best non-genre film is The Untouchables with Kevin Costner and Sean Connery and Andy Garcia. That's probably my favorite of his, like, more studio kind of.
Yeah.
I mean, because it's not just a standard movie. I mean, it's a period film. It's got a lot of, he takes some of his style he has in some of his lower budget movies and puts it, and there's that great scene on the staircase where like the baby carriage is going down the steps in slow motion as there's like a gunfight going on. There's some great stuff in The Untouchables, and I do think it's some of Sean Connery's best work. I'm still very happy he got an Oscar for that performance. He's really good in that. But yeah, so my third favorite is Phantom of the Paradise. My number 2 is Blowout. Blowout is so great, and in some ways I feel like it's underrated. Like I feel like when people say Brian De Palma, like some people might not immediately go to Blowout, right? It maybe is not quite as well known as some of his other titles, even of the time. But if you've never seen Blowout, oh my God, there's a great Criterion release that has a long interview with Brian De Palma about Blowout and some behind the scenes stuff. Check it out. And my number 1 is Carrie. I'm surprised that Carrie is not in your top 5. Is that just a movie you think is kind of overrated?
No, I like Carrie. I just like
Okay.
these other ones more.
Right.
I also think I kind of came to Carrie a little
Later.
late. I only
Okay.
saw it maybe in the past couple of years.
Oh, okay. So you
And
had
so
seen
it wasn't quite as formative for me. But
Right.
Phantom of the Paradise is formative, right? But like Blowout I saw in the last few years and it blew me away. And
Yeah. Carrie's
Raven,
quieter. Yeah. Than
yeah,
Blowout is.
Carrie for sure is quieter, and it has that kind of like meandering 70s vibe that I sometimes can't hang with. But
Like,
I do like it though, and I think it is really it is an interesting film and obviously a classic of horror. And I have not read the novel, but I assume you, as a big Stephen King fan, have.
yeah.
So I would be curious, probably a different conversation, but I'm kind of curious to know like how you feel it works as an adaptation of the King novel.
Well, the King book is weird because it's like 120 pages long. It's his by far like his shortest like novel, and they couldn't publish it that short. So throughout the book he'll like write some scenes, and then there'll be moments that take place after the tragedy at the high school and the prom of like files like from the police files. Here's an interview with Sue Snell, and it'll be like question answer, and it'll be like 8 pages of that, and then it'll go back to the night before the prom. So there's like a lot of that. So they've tried to incorporate that, I want to say, in the newer remakes from 2002 and 2013. Like they tried to kind of incorporate some of that. The 1976 adaptation by De Palma just does away with that. We don't get to see anything that really happens after the tragedy outside of that final scene with the dream scene with Sue Snell, which I think is the right choice. I think it kind of adds to your enjoyment of the book, but I think in a kind of a streamlined movie, it would just be too much to be jumping back and forth, and that would feel weird to me. That's why I think the first adaptation is the best. But yeah, in terms of like the heart of the book, like what's happening with Carrie and her emotions all the way through the story of the King novel, I think De Palma captures really well in the adaptation. But what's so cool is he brings in some of those stylistic elements that he has in like Sisters and Phantom of the Paradise and Obsession, which is right before Carrie. And I mean, just that long shot of them collecting the ballots and then them delivering the ballot box, and we see Carrie smiling in the background, and then the camera goes all the way up, all the way to the top, and you see the pig's blood about ready to tip over, and then they go, and the winners are, and then you see Carrie stand up and she's smiling, and like just how he uses the camera in Carrie is really great and striking. And I like how he doesn't overdo the split screen. He does it just enough in the second half, I think, to really make those last few scenes of violence like really come to life. And but yeah, it's very formative. Like it's one of the first adult books I ever read. It's one of the first R-rated horror films I ever saw when I was like 10. So that plays a role. If I had not read Carrie, seen Carrie till I was 19, maybe it would be lower like on my list. But because it is such an important film to me that way. And whenever I revisit it, I love it. Like I love Sissy Spacek's performance. Piper Laurie, who played her role thinking she was in a comedy. Did you know that?
I did not. That's
she
great.
Thought it was supposed to be a comedic horror film, and that's how she played the role. And it wasn't until she saw the finished film that she realized that, oh, she read it wrong. Oops. But that's what makes her performance so great. That it's a little hammy, but Sissy Spacek is so grounded that it just works well, and it kind of makes her out to be just a little bit more monstrous than if she had just been very quiet and subdued, the way like Julianne Moore plays it in the 2013 remake.
Right.
Piper Laurie, I just think is bringing it in that movie. I would have loved to have seen her win the the Oscar for supporting actress. That was the year of Beatrice Straight winning for Network. Her one scene in Network, she wins the Oscar, which is also a great performance, but much briefer screen time. I just love Carrie. It's my go-to De Palma. I could watch it every Halloween. I just really adore that movie, so it would be my number one choice. But these titles, so many titles here that I love. Obsession, from the same year of Carrie, I think is worth watching. Scarface, I've never been as big on as some other people are, but I admire it, and I like the Al Pacino performance. And then
Scarface is one that I think is a lot of people alight on in the same way that I think people alight on Taxi Driver, or Five Easy Pieces or The Shining, even. You pick your favorite scary Jack Nicholson. It's usually not Cuckoo's Nest, weirdly enough, although he is unsettling in that and perfectly cast. But I kind of feel that way about Scarface. I'm like, this is good. Sure.
I think Carlito's Way is better. That's the follow-up, not follow-up, but like his other film he made with Pacino in 93, 10 years later. I saw it just once a few years ago, but I was really digging Carlito's Way. A really good Sean Penn supporting performance. He's got this crazy hairdo in that movie. And then, have you been a fan of the Mission Impossible movies at all? Like, something I like about the first one is that it's a little bit more low key. It's a little bit more understated. Now it's like this, just like Fast and the Furious, craziness.
Yeah.
Franchise. The first movie is a little bit more about suspense, and it's more contained. It's got a couple big action moments, but it's a much quieter action film than what we get later with directors like John Woo and stuff.
Yeah,
and I like what De Palma brought to it.
A Philip Seymour Hoffman performance in that one, right?
That's in the third one.
That's in the
by
third
J.J.
one. Okay.
Abrams.
The J.J. Abrams one. Okay, never mind. Then that tells you really my attention to the Mission Impossible films. If I'm like, where's the one that Philip Seymour Hoffman is in? I'm not huge on action films, so like those are not. I really wouldn't put the Mission Impossibles that he directed at like the top of my De Palma list. I do really like Snake Eyes. I think it's fun.
That one's good. Yeah, that's underrated.
It's very silly, and I like that.
Cool opening shot.
Yeah. I don't think that Femme Fatale is very good.
Yeah, it's okay.
His like noir period there with Femme Fatale and Black Dahlia.
Black Dahlia is really terrible.
It's
I was
not
so
great.
excited.
Yeah. It came out at the same time roughly as Hollywoodland.
Yes. I got them confused.
Well, yeah, I think a lot of people did. And I think that hurt them, right? That's one of the cases where some competing studios are like, ooh, we got to get these two things on the same topic out at the same time. The Black Dahlia, I don't think it's great, but I also think that is perhaps an issue of the source material. I don't think it's De Palma's direction. I think it's a bad adaptation of the Elmore Leonard. And I think it's also harmed by the existence of Hollywoodland, which to me is a little bit more interesting of a film.
Yeah, that was better.
Yeah. I just like that felt like it was about something. Like it was about like Hollywood as a concept, whereas the Elmore Leonard Black Dahlia is like these two cops. It's not about her even, like that's part of the issue of crime films is it's usually not about the victim, except this is named for the victim, but it's really about the two cops and like their beef. So
Black Dahlia, I remember that came out. That was the fall of my senior year at LMU in college, and Brian De Palma, he'd made Femme Fatale, but that one kind of came and went. Mission to Mars from 2000 I saw in the theater. That was really bad. So I was like, okay, it's Black Dahlia. I know that story, and it's got a great cast, and it's coming out in the fall, like award season time. I was like, okay, this is going to be his return to form, and I saw it opening night, and I was just so disappointed. I was like, oh, this isn't good at all. This is terrible. And I think of the later films, the one probably most interesting is Passion from 2012, even though I don't remember it that much. It's got two great actresses in it, and it's got some style that kind of references back to some of his early work. So I think that's probably the most interesting of his like late stage career. But I think when you look at the best of his films, it's like the 70s and 80s. Like you get a couple little gems here and there after that, but like I do think Raising Cain is worth looking at. That's one I feel like a lot of our listeners might not have seen. Like it was kind of a small release in 92. Like check out Raising Cain, as you said, a great John Lithgow performance. And I
Yeah.
would also throw in Casualties of War in there. That's a good film with Michael J.
Mhm.
Fox and also Sean Penn again,
Yeah,
from
I haven't seen that
'89.
one. Mm.
And Bonfire of the Vanities from 1990 is so bad,
It's so
but
bad.
it's worth looking at in looking at the film and then reading The Devil's Candy, the book
Mm.
about the making of the movie. It is one of the greatest film books of all time about what happens when a movie production goes wrong. It's
Have you
amazing. The
listened to the podcast about it?
TCM podcast was that season 2.
Mm.
They had the author of the book on, and they went through audio, archival audio interviews with a lot of the actors from the time, and then it had some modern interviews. It is fascinating. Check out the TCM podcast about the making of Bonfire of the Vanities. Just, I mean, the amount of money, the amount of time they put into that, and then they bring it out Christmas weekend of 1990. And what did it premiere at, like number 11 on the top 10? I mean, it just bombed. And boy, he must have said, okay, let's make a horror film.
Yeah, let's go back to what works. Let's do Raising Cain. Yeah.
Yeah. But in a career of some misses, I do think Brian De Palma is one of the greats, one of my favorites. He has at least 6 or 7 just terrific films that I love. And I was so excited to finally, after 2.5 years of doing Film at 50, to finally get a chance to talk about him today and to finally meet you and talk to you, Stevie. This was a huge thrill. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Brian. I'm always, listen, if you're still doing this in, oh God, I guess, well, but this probably won't happen because I'm sure we'll both be dead, but I'm just saying that if Film at 50 ever gets too malignant, please, I will come back and talk to you about Malignant.
Right now, the goal is to get to Jaws. That came out in June of '75.
Okay,
that's about
great.
2 years away right now. So I'm like, that's the goal. And then I'm like, well, am I really going to stop this halfway through a year? That doesn't make sense. Wait, Carrie came out in '76. I want to talk about that. Halloween is in '78. Like, do we stop before? So I don't know. We'll see. Right now, the goal is
the whole '70s, maybe.
Well, part of me is like, well, if I end with like Kramer versus Kramer in December of '79, I should have just called this the '70s. Like,
yeah, maybe.
You know, but yeah, right now it's a huge. I mean, just this conversation we had, I learned so much. Just all of that information you shared with me, all of your studies. That was really fascinating. Part of the reason I love doing this podcast is I learned stuff from my guests, and once again, it happened here today. Fantastic information you relate to us.
Yeah, thanks. I'm happy to share my strange little knowledge.
So as we wrap up here, Stevie, is there anything you'd like to promote or tell our listeners where they can find you online?
Sure. Yes. Primarily I am on Instagram at just my name, where it is mostly pictures of what I am reading and cats, and also, not Cats the film, but cats who live in my home, to clarify. And also theater projects that I am going to and or working on. That's primarily what I'm doing these days. I write grants, so that's not exciting stuff. I don't have a lot of things to promote. But I do also, I have my own small theater company. We're called Novelties Theater. We do literary adaptations. We use dance as part of our storytelling methodology. So some of that is infused with like burlesque styles or modern dance styles. And so, yeah, so that's some stuff we do. We're based in Seattle, and you can check that out. It's noveltiestheater.org, and it's theater spelled the British way with an R-E. So
is that, do you prefer it R-E or E-R?
You know, I do prefer the RE, and I also am employed by a major theater here in Seattle that spells it with the ER, and so it is a great challenge for me to swap how I'm spelling it between documents depending on for whom I am writing.
Oh, that's a good point. That would get tricky if like you're working somewhere and they spell it the opposite way. Like you have to remember that every time you're writing something.
Yeah. It's hard to train myself out of insisting for many years that we do the British and Canadian spelling of theater when referring to, and for me, it's also a difference of like a movie theater. I don't care. That can be an ER. That's fine.
Right.
But I'm like, when it's the theater, R-E.
The theater.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. No, I feel the same way. If it's just like the local movie theater, that can be ER. But if it's like, I'm going to the theater, that's R-E.
Yeah.
Yeah,
You got to
exactly.
say it like that too. It's the theater. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks for being here, Stevie, so much. Thanks for all of you for listening. You can find us online at filmat50.com. We're on Twitter and Instagram. Check out my YouTube channel for all things Oscars at Brian Rowe Video. And until next time, remember, 50 never looked this good.